Do not board this plane. If your contract was signed by Vance, he does not offer jobs, he buys lives. Listen to Arthur's story.
Drop that subscribe button and hit us with a done in the comments. You already know God is watching, so keep it 100 and don't slide past without showing love. Let's build this tribe together.
The air in the International Airport departure hall was thick with the scent of cheap coffee, floor polish, and desperation. Outside the towering glass windows, rain streaked down in heavy gray lines, turning the tarmac into a blurry watercolor of flashing yellow runway lights and massive airplane tails. Arthur Pendelton sat on a hard plastic chair in the far corner of Gate 14, his fingers tightly laced around the edges of a worn brown leather envelope. Inside that envelope was a passport stamped with a fresh 5-year work visa, a pristine employment contract, and a one-way ticket to London. To anyone watching, Arthur was the picture of success. He wore a crisp white collared shirt that had been pressed with absolute perfection by his mother the night before. His shoes were freshly polished, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent overheads. Around him, people whispered with admiration and envy. Just 6 hours ago, Arthur's family home had been filled with dozens of relatives, neighbors, and old schoolmates. A grand send-off party had been thrown in his honor. They had slaughtered a goat, played music until the windows rattled, and offered loud, tearful prayers for his success. In his community, moving abroad was not just a personal career move. It was a total resurrection. It meant you had made it. It meant your family's days of counting pennies and praying for rain were officially over. "You are carrying our entire legacy, Arthur," his father had whispered, gripping Arthur's shoulders with rough, calloused hands that had spent 40 years in hard labor. "Do not look back. Build a life there, and reach down to pull the rest of us up." The weight of those words sat heavily in Arthur's chest, like a stone he couldn't swallow. He leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes, trying to silence the persistent anxiety humming in his blood. He had spent his entire adult life working as a low-level accountant, surviving on promises of promotions that never came. So when Julian Vance, a wealthy, charismatic expatriate who ran a global management firm, offered him a high-paying corporate role in England, Arthur had signed the papers without asking too many questions. The salary alone was 10 times what he earned locally. It was a golden ticket. Flight 402 to London Heathrow is now commencing final boarding at Gate 14, a synthesized voice chimed over the loudspeaker. Arthur stood up, his heart doing a sudden, violent flip. He slid his leather envelope into his inner suit pocket and smoothed down his jacket. He took a deep breath. "This is it," he told himself. "Your life begins today." He joined the queue of passengers shuffling toward the gate inspector. As he moved forward, a man coming from the opposite direction bumped hard into Arthur's shoulder. "Oh, excuse me, brother," the man stammered nervously. Arthur turned to reply, but the stranger was already walking away quickly, pulling his hood over his head and disappearing into the bustling terminal crowd. Arthur shook his head, brushing off his lapel, but as his hand touched his jacket pocket, he felt something stiff and unexpected slid between the lining of his coat. Arthur paused. He stepped out of the queue, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small, folded piece of heavy cream cardstock. It wasn't his document. It was a handwritten note. He unfolded it. The ink was dark blue, written in an erratic, trembling scrawl. "Do not board this plane if your contract was signed by Vance. He does not offer jobs, he buys lives. If you care about your freedom, turn around and go home right now." Arthur's breath hitched. He looked up sharply, scanning the terminal. The hooded man was gone, swallowed up by hundreds of travelers. His mind began to race. Vance. How did whoever wrote this know Julian Vance's name? Arthur looked down at the note again. The paper trembled in his grip. Suspicion flared in his mind, sharp and icy. But then, right on its heels, came the crushing weight of reality. He thought of his father's calloused hands. He thought of the thousands of dollars his family had borrowed from distant relatives to clear his processing fees and purchase his wardrobe. He thought of the entire neighborhood singing his praises just hours ago. How could he walk back into his town and say he cancelled his dream because a random stranger shoved a cryptic note into his pocket? They would call him a coward. They would say he was cursed. He would be ruined, and his family would be saddled with a lifetime of unpayable debt. "Sir, are you in line?" The airline agent called out from the desk, holding out her hand for his boarding pass. Arthur stared at the woman. Then he looked back at the note. He crushed the cardstock in his fist, shoved it deep into his trousers pocket, and smiled. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I'm ready." He handed over his pass, stepped through the gate tunnel, and boarded the massive steel bird that would carry him into the unknown. The flight was 11 hours of pure turbulence and restless sleep. When Arthur finally stepped off the plane at Heathrow, the cold English morning air hit his face like a slap. It smelled of damp jet fuel and rain, a completely different world from the warm, earthy breeze of his home country. He passed through customs without a hitch. As he stepped through the sliding doors of the arrival hall into the sea of waiting faces, a sharp-looking man in a sleek black suit held up a small wooden sign with his name printed neat and bold. Arthur Pendelton. "Mr. Pendleton?" the man asked in a crisp, formal accent as Arthur approached. "My name is Thomas. Mr. Vance sent me to pick you up. Welcome to England." "Thank you, Thomas," Arthur said, offering a polite smile. "It's a pleasure." Thomas took Arthur's heavy luggage without another word and led him through the crowded airport out to a sleek, dark-tinted luxury sedan. He opened the back door for Arthur, closed it softly once he was seated inside, and got behind the wheel. As the car glided smoothly out of the airport complex and onto the highway, Arthur leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He watched the British countryside roll past. Endless rolling green hills, old stone fences, and tall oak trees stripped bare by the coming winter. It looked beautiful, peaceful, and impossibly wealthy. The doubt that had plagued him on the plane began to evaporate. The strange note in his pocket felt foolish now, like a cruel prank designed to ruin his confidence. After nearly 2 hours of driving, the car turned off the main highway onto a long, winding gravel driveway flanked by towering pine trees. At the end of the driveway stood a massive estate. It was a sprawling Victorian manor built from dark red brick, with grand arches, tall stained-glass windows, and immaculate manicured gardens stretching into the distance. The car pulled up to the grand front entrance. Thomas stepped out and opened Arthur's door. "Here we are, sir. Oakwood Manor," Thomas said. "Mr. Vance's primary residence and headquarters. You'll be staying here for your orientation period." Arthur stepped out, taking in the sheer size of the building. It was breathtaking. A butler opened the heavy oak front doors, bowing slightly as Arthur entered the foyer. The interior was even more grand than the outside. High ceilings with crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over polished marble floors, antique oil paintings, and grand Persian rugs. "Welcome, Arthur." A booming melodic voice echoed down the sweeping marble staircase. Julian Vance descended the stairs with effortless grace. He was a tall, handsome man in his late 50s, with silver-streaked hair, sharp blue eyes, and an expansive smile. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Arthur's family earned in 5 years. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, stepping forward to shake his hand. "It is an honor to finally meet you in person." "The honor is mine, my boy," Vance said warmly, wrapping both of his hands around Arthur's in a gesture of paternal affection. "Look at you. You made the journey. I know how difficult it is to leave everything you know behind, but I assure you, you have made the best decision of your life. In this house, we don't just build careers, we build legacies." Vance put a comforting arm around Arthur's shoulders and led him deeper into the manor. "You must be exhausted," Vance continued seamlessly. "We'll save business for tomorrow. Tonight you rest. I've had my staff prepare the guest wing for you." Vance led Arthur down a long, quiet corridor lined with closed doors and antique portraits, stopping at a massive dark wood door near the end. He pushed it open to reveal a luxurious suite. It featured a king-sized bed with silk sheets, a blazing stone fireplace, a private study desk, and an adjoining master bathroom. "This is incredible, Mr. Vance," Arthur said, genuinely moved by the hospitality. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Work hard, Arthur. That's all the thanks I require," Vance said with a reassuring wink. "Oh, one small administrative detail before I let you rest." Vance reached out his hand, palm up, smiling casually. "Your passport and travel documents. Per standard immigration procedure for our corporate visa sponsors, we keep the original documents safely locked in our corporate vault downstairs. It protects you from loss or theft while your residence card is being processed by the Home Office." Arthur hesitated for a fraction of a second. The memory of the note in his pocket flared like a match in the dark. But Vance's smile was so warm, his presence so entirely respectable, that questioning him felt utterly absurd. Arthur reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his leather document pouch, and handed it to Vance. "Of course," Arthur said. "Splendid," Vance beamed, tucking the pouch under his arm. "Dinner will be served at 8. Rest up, Arthur. Welcome to your new life." Vance stepped out, shutting the door behind him with a solid, heavy click. Arthur let out a long, weary sigh and tossed his suit jacket over the back of an armchair. The tension of the last 24 hours seemed to wash away all at once. He walked over to the grand mahogany desk in the corner, pulled out his mobile phone, and turned off airplane mode. He wanted to call his mother. He wanted to tell his father that the manor was real, that Mr. Vance was a gentleman, and that all their sacrifices had been worth it. He stared at the screen. No service. Arthur frowned. He stepped closer to the window, holding the phone up. Still 0 bars. "Strange," he muttered. "A house this grand surely had a private Wi-Fi network." He decided to step out into the hallway to ask one of the house staff for the Wi-Fi password. He walked over to the heavy oak door, grabbed the polished brass handle, and turned it. The handle moved, but the door didn't budge. Arthur blinked. He pulled harder. The door remained firmly shut against its frame. There was no keyhole on his side, only a seamless brass plate. He rattled the handle again, louder this time. Nothing. Cold sweat broke out across the back of Arthur's neck. He leaned his ear against the heavy wood. From the other side of the door, he heard a distinct, faint electronic double beep, the sound of an external automated magnetic lock engaging. Arthur stood frozen in the middle of his luxurious, gilded room. The warm fire crackled merrily in the fireplace, but the air in the room suddenly felt as frigid as ice. He reached into his trousers pocket, his trembling fingers pulling out the crumpled piece of cardstock he had tried so hard to forget. He flattened it out against his palm and read the dark blue ink once more. "He does not offer jobs, he buys lives." Arthur looked up at the closed, locked door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't an honored guest in a country estate. He was a prisoner. The silence of the room felt heavier now, suffocating and sharp. Arthur stood near the locked mahogany door, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. For nearly 20 minutes, he stayed entirely still, listening for footsteps, a key turning, or the faint click of a release mechanism. Nothing came. Only the soft, steady crackle of the wood in the fireplace broke the stillness. He walked back to the window, pushing aside the thick velvet drapes. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady gray mist. The courtyard below was deserted. He looked down. The drop from his second-floor room to the stone driveway was far too steep to jump without breaking a leg. Heavy decorative iron grills were bolted to the outer frame of the window, framing the glass like an ornate cage. "Think, Arthur. Just think," he urged himself, pressing his cold palms against his face. Panicking changes nothing. Perhaps it was a mistake. A security system that locked automatically when doors swung shut. Wealthy men in sprawling English estates were paranoid about safety. That had to be it. Julian Vance was an eccentric businessman, nothing more. Arthur forced himself to sleep, though it was a fitful, broken rest filled with visions of empty airport terminals and nameless strangers shouting warnings into the wind. At exactly 7 in the morning, a soft click-clack echoed through the heavy door. Arthur snapped awake instantly, sitting upright on the edge of the plush bed. The brass handle turned, and the door swung open. A young woman in a sharp white medical tunic stepped into the room carrying a small stainless steel tray with a pitcher of water and a glass. Behind her stood Thomas, the quiet driver who had picked Arthur up at the airport, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "Good morning, Arthur," the woman said. Her voice was soft, even, and low. "I hope you rested well after your long flight." Arthur stood up immediately, taking a step toward the doorway. "The door was locked from the outside last night. I couldn't open it." Thomas didn't move an inch, his broad shoulder subtly blocking the exit route into the corridor. "Ah, yes," the woman replied smoothly, setting the tray down on the side table. "The Manor's central security system engages automatically at 10 p.m. It is standard safety protocol for Mr. Vance's private estates. Guests are always informed, but Mr. Vance mentioned he forgot to hand you your room keycard yesterday evening." She pulled a thin silver keycard from her pocket and placed it on the table next to the water glass. "I am Clara Sterling," she added, offering a polite, distant nod. "I am the resident medical caretaker on the estate. Mr. Vance is expecting you in the main office on the ground floor for breakfast and your initial orientation." Arthur studied Clara's face. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with sharp gray eyes and pale features. Her expression was completely composed, but Arthur noticed something subtle. Her left hand was trembling slightly as she adjusted the tray, and she kept her eyes strictly lowered, avoiding direct eye contact with Thomas. "Thank you, Clara," Arthur said cautiously. "Please refresh yourself and come downstairs." "Mr. Vance does not like to be kept waiting," Thomas said, his voice flat and authoritative. 5 minutes later, Arthur walked down the sweeping marble staircase toward the main dining hall. The estate was vast, quiet, and blindingly opulent. Sunlight filtered through tall arched windows, casting long rays across polished wood floors and expensive artwork. Yet, as Arthur walked, he noticed subtle details he had missed the night before. Small, black-dome security cameras mounted subtly in every high corner of the hallway ceiling, their tiny red lights blinking rhythmically. Julian Vance was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany dining table, reading a printed financial report while sipping dark coffee. "Ah, Arthur. Good morning." Vance beamed, laying his paper aside and gesturing to the chair beside him, which was laden with fresh fruit, pastries, and eggs. "Come sit. You look like a man who has traveled across half the world." Arthur sat down, attempting to match Vance's easy smile. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. It is quite a place you have here." "It is a sanctuary, Arthur," Vance said, taking a sip of his coffee. "A sanctuary built on discipline, hard work, and loyalty. Today your training begins. As my junior portfolio coordinator, you will be handling high-value asset transfers between our international subsidiaries." "I am ready to work," Arthur said. He paused, picking up his fork before looking up casually. "By the way, my mobile phone didn't have any cellular signal last night. Is there a local Wi-Fi password I could use? I promised my father I would send a message as soon as I settled in." Vance's warm smile didn't fade, but his sharp blue eyes hardened just a fraction. He wiped his lips with a linen napkin before speaking. "Ah, the modern necessity of constant communication," Vance said light-heartedly. "Oakwood Manor is located in a protected valley. Mobile towers don't reach us out here. As for our internal internet network, it is strictly encrypted to prevent corporate espionage and financial leaks." Vance leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Every external letter, email, or message sent from this estate must pass through our secure communications server upstairs. It is a standard compliance requirement for foreign workers handling sensitive offshore accounts. You may draft a typed letter to your family on the office terminal today." My administrative team will review it for security clearance and transmit it directly to your father's local post office by nightfall. A cold knot formed in Arthur's stomach. Green mail. Encrypted terminals. Locked doors. I understand, Arthur said softly, swallowing his food with difficulty. Excellent, Vance said, clapping his hands together once. Let us get to work. Over the next 3 days, Arthur was inducted into his daily routine. His job was straightforward yet strangely abstract. He sat in a sleek glass-walled office on the first floor, reviewing massive spreadsheets containing personal identification details, offshore bank routing numbers, and corporate trust accounts. His job was to verify that names, birth dates, and identity numbers matched between different legal documents before authorized transfers were executed. On paper, it looked like standard international asset management. But as an accountant trained to notice numbers that didn't align, Arthur began to spot troubling anomalies. The account files he was processing belonged to individuals from developing nations, teachers, engineers, and young professionals who had recently moved to Western nations under corporate sponsorships. Yet, the bank accounts attached to their names were moving millions of dollars in rapid, complex loops through shell companies in various island tax havens. Why would a junior engineer from South America be moving €3 million through a logistics firm in Panama? On Thursday afternoon, while walking down the quiet East Wing corridor to drop off physical files at the archive room, Arthur saw Clara emerging from a heavy iron door at the end of the hall. She was carrying a tray lined with prescription bottles and discarded medical bandages. Arthur slowed his pace. Clara! Clara jumped, startled by his voice. She looked around the hallway nervously before stepping closer to him. Arthur! You shouldn't be wandering this wing, she whispered, her voice tight with strain. I'm just delivering files to the archive, Arthur said, holding up his leather folder. He stepped closer, dropping his voice to a whisper. Clara, what is this place really? Why are our messages screened? Why are there security cameras in every corridor? Clara's eyes flicked up toward the black dome camera 20 feet away. She turned her body slightly, using her shoulder to block the camera's view of her face. Don't look at the cameras, she hissed under her breath. And stop asking questions. Vance watches everything. He reads every letter you type. If you write anything suspicious to your family, the system flags it, and the message never leaves this house. And my passport, Arthur pressed. He said it was in a corporate vault. The vault is in the basement office behind Vance's private study, Clara muttered quickly. Listen to me, Arthur. The men who come here, they think they are starting new careers. But once you give up your documents, you don't exist outside these gates anymore. Watch what you say. Watch what you write. Before Arthur could ask anything more, Clara turned briskly and walked away, her shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. That night sleep was impossible. The weight of Clara's warning burned in Arthur's mind. He lay on his back in the dark, staring up at the grand plaster ceiling of his room. He realized with absolute clarity that if he waited for Vance to hand back his passport willingly, he would never leave Oakwood Manor. He was an unpaid cog in a hidden machine, trapped by his own pride and desire for success. At 2 a.m., Arthur stood up. He dressed silently in dark trousers and a black sweater. He grabbed the silver security keycard Clara had given him days ago and approached his door. He slid the card through the slot. A tiny green light flashed, and the heavy lock clicked open. Arthur stepped into the dim, cold hallway. The manor was dead quiet, lit only by the faint red glow of exit signs and emergency lights. He stayed close to the wall, keeping his head down to avoid direct line of sight with the overhead cameras, moving like a shadow toward the east wing where Vance's private office was located. He reached the heavy double doors of Vance's study. To his surprise, the door was slightly ajar. A faint strip of light poured out onto the carpet. Arthur held his breath, pressing his back against the wall next to the frame. He peered through the thin gap. The room was empty. Vance's desk lamp was left on, illuminating a mountain of paperwork and an open metallic cabinet in the corner of the room behind the heavy oak desk. Heart hammering against his ribs, Arthur slipped into the room and closed the door soundlessly behind him. He moved quickly to the open metal cabinet. Inside were dozens of thick black binders organized alphabetically. Arthur pulled out a binder labeled Personal/Sponsored Assets, Class B. He flipped open the heavy ringed binder. Page after page contained photographs of young men and women from all over the world, accompanied by copies of their passports, birth certificates, and employment contracts. Across several pages, thick red rubber stamps read, "Deactivated/identity reassigned." Arthur's breath stopped. He flipped frantically to the section under P. There it was. A full-color copy of his own passport photo stared back at him. Beside his photograph were documents Arthur had never seen before. Loan applications in his name for millions of pounds, foreign shell corporation registrations listing Arthur Pendelton as the sole liable director, and legal power of attorney forms bearing a forged copy of his signature. They hadn't hired him to manage investments. They had stolen his identity, converting his clean financial record into an anonymous shield for money laundering, while keeping him locked away in an isolated country manor. To the legal world outside, Arthur Pendelton was a ghost director moving untraceable wealth across international borders. To the real world, he had simply vanished into the shadows of a foreign land. Suddenly, the heavy metal door handle of the study began to turn. The heavy brass handle rotated slowly, the metallic latch retracting with an agonizing, sharp click. Arthur's heart slammed into his throat. In a split second, instinct overrode panic. He shoved the black binder back into the cabinet, slid the drawer shut without making a sound, and dropped flat onto his stomach behind the massive carved mahogany desk just as the double door swung open. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Through the narrow gap between the desk's base and the floor, Arthur saw a pair of polished black leather shoes stop right in front of the open cabinet. It was Vance. Arthur held his breath, his chest tight, his cheek pressed flat against the cold Persian rug. The silence in the room stretched so thin it felt violently fragile. He could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of Vance's gold wristwatch. Vance reached out, his hand entering Arthur's line of sight, and gently pushed the cabinet door until it clicked locked. He paused, his head turning slightly as if listening to the air in the room. For 5 terrifying seconds, Vance didn't move. Then, with a quiet grunt, he turned around, walked over to his desk, picked up a forgotten leather organizer, and strolled back out, shutting the double doors behind him. The electronic lock beeped loudly from the hallway. Arthur remained frozen on the floor for 2 full minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, he pushed himself up, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. He had seen the truth. There was no corporate ladder to climb. There was no glorious career awaiting him. He was raw material in a machinery of legal human theft. He needed to get out, and he needed to do it before Vance realized he knew too much. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the subtle pretense of warm hospitality began to crumble. When Arthur walked into the dining room for breakfast, Vance was already seated, but he was not reading his usual financial paper. He was staring directly at the doorway, his eyes fixed on Arthur with an icy, calculating intensity. "Good morning, Arthur," Vance said. His voice lacked its usual booming warmth. It was flat, clipped, and clinical. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," Arthur replied, keeping his voice carefully neutral as he sat down. "You look tired," Vance observed, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "Did you sleep poorly last night?" "I'm still adjusting to the weather," Arthur lied smoothly, pouring himself a cup of tea. "It's much colder here than back home." "Yes. It takes time to adapt to a new environment," Vance said quietly. "Some people adapt quickly. Others resist. They struggle against the reality of their position, futilely attempting to fight forces far larger than themselves." Vance reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the polished table. It stopped inches from Arthur's teacup. "What is this?" Arthur asked. "A report from our field office back home," Vance said softly. "It seems your old friend, Marcus Reed, has been making unwanted inquiries. He visited your father's house twice this week, asking why your messages seem so short, so impersonal, so rehearsed." Arthur's blood ran cold. "Marcus is just a good friend. He worries about me." "He should worry about himself," Vance replied, leaning forward, his face inches from Arthur's. The illusion of the benevolent mentor was completely gone now, replaced by a cold, predatory authority. "Your friend Marcus works as a school teacher, doesn't he? Travels along that dark country road on his bicycle every evening around 6 o'clock. The threat was implicit, sharp, and undeniable. "I tell you this so you understand the architecture of your reality, Arthur," Vance continued, his voice dropping to a smooth whisper. "You belong to this firm now. Your identity, your credit, your legal existence, they are assets managed by me. You keep your head down, you execute the wire transfers assigned to you, and your family back home continues to receive a very generous monthly stipend. But if you try to burn down the house, Arthur, remember who stands closest to the fire." Arthur stared at Vance, his jaws clenched so tightly his teeth hurt. The trap was absolute. If he ran, his family paid the price. If he stayed, he would eventually be discarded once his identity was completely drained of value. "I understand, Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice forced into a calm he didn't feel. "Good," Vance smiled, standing up and patting Arthur heavily on the shoulder. "I knew you were an intelligent young man." Later that afternoon, Arthur found himself in the narrow secondary corridor near the medical dispensary. He didn't have to wait long. Clara appeared from the laundry room carrying a stack of clean linens. Arthur stepped into her path, blocking her way near a dead zone between two security cameras. "They know Marcus is asking questions," Arthur said under his breath, his tone urgent. "Vance threatened my family today." Clara stopped, her face paling. She glanced left and right before pulling Arthur into a small linen supply closet, pulling the door almost shut behind them. "I told you to be careful," she whispered frantically. "Vance doesn't make empty threats. He has operatives everywhere." "I saw the files, Clara," Arthur said, taking her by the upper arms. "I saw my name stamped, identity reassigned. I know what he's doing. How long do I have before he finishes using me?" Clara looked into his eyes, her gray eyes filled with a mixture of fear and profound pity. 6 months, usually. Sometimes less. Once the foreign shell accounts attached to your name are fully processed and flagged by regulatory authorities, Vance declares the asset compromised. He wipes your digital footprint, terminates your visa paperwork remotely, and shifts you to an off-grid processing facility in Eastern Europe. You become an untraceable non-person. Arthur swallowed hard. "How many people are here right now?" 14, Clara replied softly. "In the West Wing and the basement dorms. Professionals, graduates, nurses, engineers, all lured by high-paying job offers abroad, all stripped of their passports the moment they arrived. Then we leave," Arthur said fiercely. "You and me. We take the evidence, we get our passports, and we tear this place down." Clara shook her head rapidly, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's impossible, Arthur. The estate is locked down with armed guards at the main gate. The server room with the physical passports in the basement vault requires a master keycard held by Vance himself." "Nothing is impossible," Arthur said, his voice steadying. "There is always a flaw in every system. Look at this house. It relies entirely on power, network servers, and routine. Tomorrow night, there's a heavy storm forecast across the county." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "What are you planning?" "A power grid failure forces the magnetic security locks to run on backup battery generators for exactly 15 minutes before the main diesel generators kick in," Arthur explained, relying on the structural blueprints he had memorized from the building's compliance files. "During those 15 minutes, the automated camera servers reset. That is our window. Clara looked at him for a long moment, the fear in her eyes gradually giving way to a flicker of defiance. Vance keeps the master keycard in his private bedroom safe when he sleeps, Clara whispered, stepping closer. I carry the nightly medical sedatives for his brother in the West Wing. I pass Vance's room every night at 1 a.m. Get the keycard, Arthur said. I will handle the basement vault and secure our real passports. Meet me at the rear kitchen exit at 1:15 a.m. sharp. If we clear the outer fence before the secondary generators engage, we can reach the main highway. And if we get caught? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Arthur looked down at his calloused hands, the same hands that carried his father's hopes across an ocean. If we get caught, at least we die as ourselves, Arthur said quietly. Not as ghosts in Vance's ledger. Clara nodded slowly, sealing an unwritten pact. Outside the small closet window, grey storm clouds were already gathering heavy on the horizon, darkening the English sky as night began to fall. The storm was coming, and with it, their one and only chance at freedom. The storm struck Oakwood Manor at midnight with a furious, unrelenting force. Rain slammed against the grand stained glass windows in heavy sheets, and violent gusts of wind rattled the old oak frames. Thunder crashed directly overhead, shaking the deep foundations of the Victorian estate. In his room, Arthur sat on the edge of the bed fully clothed, his boots laced tightly, staring at the face of his wristwatch. 1:05 a.m. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening roar of thunder. A second later, the soft hum of the electric wall sconces sputtered and died. The entire manor plunged into pitch blackness. Arthur stood up instantly. From deep within the walls, the high-pitched rhythmic chirp of the emergency power backup system echoed. He had exactly 15 minutes before the heavy diesel generators in the east shed kicked in and brought the security cameras and secondary electronic locks back online. He moved like a shadow out into the hallway. The corridors were shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the frantic white flashes of lightning through the high-arched windows. Arthur stayed low, moving swiftly toward the basement stairs. The air grew colder and damp as he descended into the lower levels of the manor. He reached the heavy iron door of the server and document vault. A figure emerged from the shadows near the doorway. Arthur flinched, pulling back, until a faint beam from a penlight revealed Clara's pale, determined face. "You made it," Arthur whispered, his heart pounding. Clara didn't speak. She held up a thin, black metallic card, Vance's master keycard. Her hand was trembling, but her grip was tight. "He was sleeping," Clara breathed, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. The storm masked the sound of the door. She pressed the master keycard against the vault's electronic lock reader. Powered by the lingering battery backup, a green light flickered to life with a quiet click beep. The heavy iron deadbolts retracted. Arthur pulled the vault door open. Inside, rows of metal filing cabinets and server racks stood in the dark. Guided by Clara's tiny light, Arthur rushed to the central steel cabinet labeled Primary Identities/Original Documents. He took a heavy screwdriver he had managed to slip from the maintenance room earlier that day and jammed it into the lock mechanism, applying all his weight. With a loud metallic snap, the latch broke. He pulled the drawer open. Inside were hundreds of original international passports, birth certificates, and land titles, organized neatly by country. Arthur's hands flew through the files. Pendleton! Pendleton! He grabbed his brown leather pouch. He unzipped it. His passport, his original birth certificate, and his true identity were intact inside. He tucked them firmly into his inner jacket pocket. "Clara, grab yours. Grab as many as you can," Arthur urged, shoving stacks of original passports into a heavy canvas bag from the shelf. "If we take these, his whole network crumbles." "Not quite, Arthur." A cold, smooth voice shattered the dark. A powerful LED flashlight beam snapped on, blinding them both. Standing in the doorway of the vault stood Julian Vance, wrapped in a dark silk robe. his face carved into an expression of murderous rage. Flanking him were Thomas and two heavy-set security guards armed with heavy wooden batons. "Did you really think a storm would afford you an escape?" Vance said softly, stepping into the room as the guards moved to block the only exit. "I built this system, Arthur. I know every wire, every breaker, every heartbeat inside this house." Clara backed away, shrinking against the metal cabinets, but Arthur stood his ground, placing himself between Vance and Clara. "It's over, Vance," Arthur said, his voice deep and steady despite the adrenaline roaring through his veins. "I have the original documents. I know about the shell companies, the identity reassignments, and the offshore accounts." Vance chuckled, a low, terrifying sound that echoed off the concrete vault walls. "And who will you tell, Arthur?" Vance asked, taking a step closer. "To the Home Office. You are an undocumented foreigner standing on private property. To the bank servers in Zurich. Your name has already authorized £50 million in offshore transfers. If you walk out that door, you step into a world where you are a wanted criminal, while I remain a respected philanthropist." Vance reached out his hand. "Give me the bag, step back into your room, and we can pretend this little midnight excursion never happened. Do not ruin your life for a foolish, noble gesture." Arthur looked at Vance. He looked at the heavy canvas bag in his hand containing the stolen lives of dozens of innocent, ambitious men and women who had crossed oceans chasing a dream, only to find a cage. He thought of his father's calloused hands. He thought of his mother's prayers. He remembered the note shoved into his pocket at the airport. "He does not offer jobs. He buys lives." "My father told me never to look back," Arthur said slowly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "But he also taught me never to let another man own my name." With a sudden, violent movement, Arthur hurled the heavy metal screwdriver directly at the overhead emergency battery junction box mounted on the wall. The tool struck the exposed wiring with a brilliant shower of blue sparks and a loud explosion. The backup battery shorted out instantly, plunging the vault into absolute pitch-black darkness. "Grab him!" Vance shouted, his smooth composure breaking into a roar. Shouts and heavy footsteps echoed in the dark. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed Clara's hand and lunged forward into the chaos. He slammed his shoulder hard into the first guard, knocking the man backward into Thomas. "Run!" Arthur yelled. They burst out of the vault into the basement corridor just as a heavy mechanical roar echoed from the outer compound. The main diesel generators had kicked in. The emergency red floor lights flickered on, illuminating the hallway in a crimson glow. Arthur and Clara sprinted up the basement stairs, racing toward the rear kitchen exit. Behind them, the heavy footfalls of Thomas and the guards pounded up the steps. They reached the heavy reinforced kitchen door. Arthur slammed the master keycard against the reader just as the secondary power grid fully engaged. The lock green-lighted, and Arthur shoved the door open with his entire weight. The freezing rain and howling wind hit them like a wall. They scrambled out into the stormy night, their boots slipping on the wet gravel driveway. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the towering iron perimeter gates 200 yards away. "The side gate!" Clara screamed over the roar of the storm, pointing toward a smaller service entrance embedded in the stone wall near the overgrown gardens. "It uses a mechanical latch." They ran through the blinding rain, the mud clinging to their shoes. Behind them, heavy flashlights swept across the grounds as Vance's men poured out of the manor. They reached the iron service gate. Arthur grabbed the heavy iron bolt, his fingers slipping on the wet metal. He slammed his hip against the gate, pulling with all his strength. With a loud screech of rusted metal, the bolt slid back. Arthur shoved Clara through the opening first, then threw his body through just as Thomas rounded the corner of the stone wall. Arthur slammed the gate shut behind them and jammed a fallen thick wooden oak branch through the iron handles, wedging it tight. They didn't stop running. They sprinted down the dark, muddy country road in the pouring rain, leaving the shadows of Oakwood Manor far behind them. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs trembled, until the grand estate was nothing more than a faint, distant memory swallowed by the English storm. 3 hours later, as the first pale light of dawn broke over the city of London, Arthur and Clara walked through the grand glass doors of the High Commission embassy. They were soaked to the skin, covered in mud, and exhausted beyond measure. But in Arthur's hands was the heavy canvas bag, and tucked close to his chest was his brown leather pouch. 2 months later, Arthur sat at a small wooden table outside a quiet roadside cafe back home. The morning air was warm, rich with the smell of damp earth and roasting corn. The local news had made international headlines weeks ago. An elite international identity trafficking syndicate operating out of an English country manor had been completely dismantled by federal authorities. Dozens of foreign victims had had their names cleared, their passports returned, and their futures restored. Julian Vance was awaiting trial in a high-security facility, his vast network of shell companies frozen and liquidated. Arthur picked up his cup of tea, watching his father working peacefully in the garden across the yard. Marcus was sitting beside Arthur, laughing as he read a letter sent by Clara, who had safely relocated to start a legitimate medical career in Canada. Arthur turned his head, looking directly out, as if speaking to anyone who stood where he had once stood, standing at the edge of a dream, staring at a plane ticket, desperate for a shortcut to success. "Moving abroad isn't a crime," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying the deep, quiet weight of a man who had walked through the dark and returned to the light. "Ambition isn't a sin. But remember this: no honest opportunity demands that you hand over your freedom before you even begin. If a promise sounds too golden to be true, inspect the cage before you step inside." He took a slow sip of his tea, smiled at the warm morning sun and whispered, "Protect your name. It is the only thing you truly own."